Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behavior as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Welcome back to another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. And as you can clearly tell by the accent, I am not Christian Hunt. This is your co-host today, Tom Hardin. Who is Tom Hardin? I share my personal case study as FBI informant Tipper X with companies and conferences as part of compliance, conduct, and culture programs, with more information available at tipperx.com. And I'm joined, of course, by your regular host, Christian Hunt. Christian, how are you today?
I'm really good, Tom. Thanks. Lovely to be back with you on another discussion of some interesting things that we've come across.
Great. We'll be diving into the ABCs of stories we've found interesting over the past few weeks, covering Airbnb, the online marketplace for offering homestays, Boeing, the U.S. aerospace manufacturer, and cheating in the context of university exams, as well as finishing up with a TV miniseries and book recommendation. Christian, why don't we get started with our A topic, Airbnb.
I wanted to pick this up because I've been reading quite a bit about platform businesses, so the Ubers, the Airbnbs of this world, and they've been getting themselves into all kinds of trouble, primarily because they're not equipped to think about some of the risks that they end up running by being a business that is facilitating something. And so when that something goes wrong, their model really doesn't have them owning the underlying assets. So whether it's in the case of Uber, a car, or Airbnb, property, they're just facilitating connection. So they pretend to be a platform, but actually what they're selling to people is an entire solution. So when something goes wrong, they're not necessarily equipped to take responsibility. And so we've seen instances with Airbnb of scams happening where people were sold the opportunity to stay in a property that didn't exist and were kind of conned into something. We had the incident recently of the party where there was fatalities. Uber's had its own situation with drivers doing things that weren't necessarily appropriate. And so I kind of think this is really interesting because we've got all these businesses there that are highly valued, but from a risk perspective, they don't necessarily seem to be taking end-to-end responsibility for everything that's going on.
It's interesting. These platform businesses seem to rotate their weeks of press nightmares. And so Airbnb has been up the last few weeks. As you mentioned, there was a Vice article, a 6,000-word article about a scam that the author went through, and she found other people who wrote to her about similar scams and the tragic shooting on Halloween night at a rental in Northern California. Brian Chesky, the CEO, was out at a conference in New York a couple of weeks ago during the standard corporate apology thing. He was on a podcast with Kara Swisher. We're looking into this. We're changing some of our terms. We've been slow to implement strong verification policies. It does come across as the standard corporate apology thing, but also a little bit disingenuous. As you mentioned, the goal of these platform businesses is to expand as fast as possible. You have to create liquidity on the platform, whether it's the host guests on Airbnb or the drivers, riders on Uber. And by design, when these businesses are started, those verifications and controls and checks in the process are not going to be built in initially because that would cause friction to joining the platform. So it's almost until we have one of these corporate scandals or something so tragic as a loss of life to happen at this house where they have to come out now and put some of these controls and verifications in. I wonder why that is.
It just seems to me that these are all built as disruptors. So you have a kind of established business model and they come in, and the disruption they cause is firstly by building a peer-to-peer connection, which doesn't require them to own the underlying asset. They just come in and kind of facilitate. The simple model is I'll facilitate a connection between a passenger and a cab. I'll facilitate a connection between someone that wants a room and someone that has a room that they can let them. And so they sat in that space, which it becomes a software challenge, a coding challenge, rather than an owning of physical assets challenge. And so they kind of, I think, stepped into a space where they recognized an opportunity to smooth things out. But in doing that, it became, the software became the solution. And they didn't really think about owning responsibility for what they were in fact selling, which was this: we're providing you with a solution. We are marketing a solution to you, but we don't actually own the provision of that solution. And that's really good from a cost-based perspective because you can just take a clip each time somebody uses your platform without needing to own the underlying asset or take responsibility for the underlying asset. So I think the idea was quite smart, but it doesn't take too much of a genius to predict that things aren't always going to go smoothly, and your reputation rests on when things go wrong as much as when they go right. And so I think it was entirely predictable that what was going to happen was people were going to find themselves, the point of delivery was going to go wrong, and in some cases it's gone hideously wrong. And who are people going to turn to? You're going to turn to the platform that's encouraged you to use the service in the first place. So I think there was something flawed in the design of these things that said we don't need to concern ourselves with that, because from a technical perspective, from a legal perspective, we're not providing the service. We're just connecting people. But I think human beings look through that, right? And we go, no, I've signed up with you. You've sold me a vision of what you're delivering, and I hold you responsible.
Yeah, and I think here, if I'm a board member, anticipation of these consequences is kind of my job. And I would look at this as, hey, when we build this out, there's the network effect. The bigger you get, the more entrenched your competitive position. Go, be the dominant force, get to scale, and then we'll worry about these issues. I suppose that there's an acceptable amount of risk that you build into this. Hey, I don't know what the number is, but maybe 1% of all our listings are scams, but we're fine with that because it's go, damn the torpedoes, build this out. And I wonder, now that we're in this moment where they're having to take a look at their verification processes and that type of thing, if we're going to see some type of change. And Airbnb and Uber are, I guess I would call them analog products as opposed to digital. Like, I'm staying in your house or I'm getting into your car physically.
Right.
And I can't imagine, if I'm the chief risk officer of Airbnb, can you imagine the number of scenarios you'd have to go through with over 2 million people every night using your service? Like, what could happen? I mean, the calls they must get on scams or just weird things happening, it must be impossible to say the number of different situations they could encounter, because I can't even imagine being in customer service or having to train those people when there's just so many different situations that would be impossible to get your arms around.
Your depiction of the sort of risk profile is entirely correct. You know, some of the worst case scenarios, the reputational damage that these stories do is off the scale. And so I'm not sure that, you know, whether it's feasible to insure is one question, but I'm not sure that you can insure against the reputational risk. The risks these platforms are running in terms of their ongoing viability isn't so much about the profitability piece. I think it's when things go wrong, it can go hideously wrong.
And I think, you know, in the wake of WeWork, which we discussed before, Airbnb has said, you know, they're going to go public in 2020. And so I'm sure they're meeting with bankers, and the bankers are coming around telling them how great they are, founders, all these types of things as bankers do. And as we discussed with WeWork, you have to think about what would the risk factors look like in this Airbnb document coming out next year. And one of the interviews, the face-saving interviews, CEO Brian Chesky did this week, he was asked, like, what's your number one concern? What keeps you up at night? The standard CEO question. And whereas today Mark Zuckerberg says Elizabeth Warren is his number one risk becoming president. And so Chesky just said, basically, my number one concern is people lose trust in the platform. He said, it's not regulation. We've been dealing with regulators since day one because we're in your neighborhood. It's really that people wake up one day and lose trust in the platform. He said this terrible quintuple shooting in California is a 1 in a million situation, and that's all people hear about. Well, if I have 2 million people every night using my platform, do I really want 2 situations like that potentially every night? So it's something to think about.
And I think the other thing that's they're undoing slightly is the very nature of these digital platforms, you know, that makes them pervasive and allows them to scale, also means that every single one of your customers is online. So by default, have access to social media and all these things. So the network effect plays against you. Bad news stories will spread as quickly as good news stories will spread. And I think that is something that they're going to have to think about. And then the other bit that, as you were talking, occurred to me is, as if you think about these peer-to-peer pieces, the principle is we're just connecting a driver with a passenger or an accommodation provider with someone that wants somewhere to sleep. Of course, you've got risk on both sides. Whereas if I think about sort of a human risk scenario ordinarily, your customer, they can represent a risk to you. Banks and money laundering would be a good example. But generally speaking, you've only got the risk on one side. In this case, you have two populations, both of whose, and of course, both the provider and the user of the service are in essence your customers because both of them are paying you. So you end up with pincer movement of risk, which means it's not just confined to one side of the equation. It's the supply and the demand can cause you problems.
Yeah. And I think as Airbnb, it looks like they've stepped up here a little bit, taking on more of that responsibility, it's going to cost them. And so when we see, you know, the document next year before they go public, there'll be more losses than people were anticipating a few months ago. But you almost have to do that. You have to take more responsibility for what's happening because, as you said, there's not just scammers on the host side. There's people that are guests that could also be using it in unexpected ways. So when it was started 11 years ago, Chesky in his apartment blowing up air mattresses and airbedandbreakfast.com, you know, now it's 100,000 cities in the world. One interesting stat in one of these articles is they actually manage more money and more transactions transactions in different currencies than even PayPal, which is just shocking, the scale of that. 100,000 cities, over 2 million people every night. And just the scenario analysis you must go through on the risk side just got my head spinning a little bit. Can you just imagine? We could be days and days in the boardroom going through every potential scenario and not even get to crack the potential scale of this thing.
The IPO happens next year. There's going to be some very interesting documentation to wade through.
Absolutely. All right, now let's turn over to Boeing. The CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg, in the last couple of weeks had been tarred and feathered by a U.S. congressional committee about the company's safety culture in light of the two recent crashes of the 737 MAX airline in the past 12 months, which resulted in the deaths of about 346 people, I think it was. The whole crisis has called into question the future of the 737 MAX. It's been grounded for the past 8 months. Really the credibility of Boeing, too, as a company, which was accused by several Congress people as, in a pattern of deliberate concealment involving the MAX and the supplying flying coffins. Pretty strong language. Investigations have pointed to this MCAS anti-stall software on the MAX as a major factor in the crash. Boeing is accused of producing a flawed design and failing to give pilots enough information on how to handle it. And at the heart of this story, the New York Times has done a great investigation on their daily podcast. I always encourage people to listen to a couple of those episodes over the last 8 months. The heart of the story here is the relationship between Boeing and their regulator, the FAA, in the States. For years, the FAA has been pushed by Congress to give Boeing more control over the process of approving its own planes. Industry groups have been lobbying for it, and many of the top officials at the FAA actually support this approach, saying they can't really get the talented people they used to get that had 4 or 5 years of experience several years ago to man the post at the FAA. So they're pushing down more self-regulation to Boeing, which is how this software problem, I don't think, was flagged by the regulator until it was way too late after these two crashes. So it's interesting, the dynamic with the regulator, the dynamic with the typical corporate apology that we just talked about with Airbnb, with the Boeing CEO out there saying, we're sorry, we're looking into it. A lot to unpack here.
It's tragic, obviously, firstly. But the one thing I think is interesting is this is an industry that if one looked at it and said, do they understand the potential for human error and how do they handle it? You would historically have said they're really, really good at this stuff. But you are more likely to die by being kicked to death by a donkey than you are getting on a plane, which is incredible if you think about the underlying dynamic. This is a pressurized tube that you shove into the air with a load of people on it, and you kind of expect to take off in one place. And there's loads of these things in the air. There's about 1 million people in the air at any one time, I read somewhere. It is statistically a pretty safe activity. And that's because I think the regulatory environment has been very intelligent, and they share information about when things go wrong, and they have a kind of no blame reporting culture, and everybody seems to be doing everything sensible. And I would say that seemed to have worked well. Now, airlines not so good at managing some of the other risks around things that go on the ground and IT systems and all those things. But the basic activity was pretty safe. And then you see this, and it's kind of undermined the whole principle of the regulatory framework being highly effective and airlines being something we could point to and say this is kind of exemplary stuff. It's shocking. And then you look at the detail of what's happened, as you say, and it's like regulatory capture times 1 million. You're basically allowing people to mark their own homework.
Yeah, and there's one guy at the heart of this story whose name is Ali Barami. He was the head of the FAA's Seattle operation for many years. He left the FAA to actually become a lobbyist for the industry, representing Boeing. Then he comes back to the FAA, and now he's head of safety at the FAA during this time. He's running the office in Seattle. He's responsible for staffing this new office, which eventually handles this certification of this software. The office has such a singular focus that it's actually even named after Boeing. They actually named the office at the regulator the Boeing Aviation Safety Oversight Office. It would be like the SEC naming their insider trading investigation unit the Tipper X unit for insider trading.
Hey, listen, always lay yourself open for new career paths. You never know, right?
My phone is open. My DMs are open. Even though it's inside the FAA, so under his management, everything started going the other way and started going sideways. But it was intentional from the top. They were trying to offload more work to the manufacturers. The FAA didn't have staff for it. So it's in this context that the Mac and this MCAS software was being reviewed, and people are trying to figure out if it's safe. This is the office that handles the Mac certification that was, putting more pressure on Boeing to do it themselves.
It's fascinating when you look at the dynamics of the industry. So I was in Seattle a few months ago, and I did the Boeing tour. And it's the first time I've ever been allowed to go close up to a plane on the ground. They don't let you do it in the factory, but they had a jet that you could walk around. One of their new Dreamliner jets on the outside. And these things are enormous. I mean, you appreciate it at an airport, but you're kind of insulated from bubble to bubble. And even if you go by bus, You're not kind of close up against them. So I was looking at this thing, and you can see them producing it, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend it if anyone's in Seattle to go look at this thing. Now, clearly they didn't make any reference to this at all, but you can sort of see the economics of this thing there are millions going into each one. There's employment associated with it. The size of the operations that they run is enormous. You can imagine the size of an aircraft factory, let alone the airfield that you need to test these things and to fly them in and out. It's an insanely large scale thing, and yet it's highly, highly vulnerable to human endeavors. So we put in place all the safety requirements around how you build the plane, the physical bits of it. But then the human decision making that's just allowed that to be overridden is quite astonishing. And this could be existential for that business and for thousands of jobs at the same time.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see this in the next 6 months evolve into a criminal negligence case. It's just amazing that, as you pointed out, if something goes wrong with an airplane, it's loss of life for everybody. The consequences for not getting something like this right with the software are as bad as they can be. And I remember reading when I was back in business school several years ago about Toyota, and they had this famous what's called an andon cord on the manufacturing line. Any employee that has a safety or quality problem can pull that cord and create discussion and a learning process about what they see. It's just shocking that nothing like this happened at Boeing. Now there are reports of whistleblowers all coming out. We'll see how that develops in the next couple of weeks. And that was not being escalated to the top, or maybe it was, or maybe being ignored, but we don't know for certain. But it's just amazing that it got to this and it wasn't ever really vetted out, or the issues weren't escalated all the way up to the top. But we'll see kind of how it develops.
I think this is so existential for the firm. It's so serious for the industry as a whole that this isn't going to resolve itself quickly. And so I think a very small amount of decisions around we're just going to override something to get this job done, that has been demonstrated to have blown up in a hideous way. And I think it's a really good example of not thinking the whole thing through. And just there's a challenge with the engineering, so we'll build a software solution and we'll kind of push the thing through to get this software solution done because we're in a competitive market. And that short-term thinking has turned to have massive long-term negative consequences that I think if you could find a way to get people to think at the point of seeing it, then they might take a different decision. But, this is a clear example, I think, of short-termist human thinking without getting the bigger picture. So, Tom, the third topic I want to pick up is the C of the ABC, which is cheating. And we talked last time about marathon cheating. And the thing I've been reading about this time is exam cheating. And there's some horrifying statistics about the proportion of people cheating in exams. And there was a story that said in the UK, for example, there's a 40% increase in the number of people cheating in their, I think it was university exams. But it's not just people doing the kind of cheating in the exam. There's a whole thing around it. There are people stealing from examination bodies. There are teachers who are getting hold of copies of answers and kind of prepping their students. It's really quite worrying in a way. And I know that technology facilitates. It's easier to cheat now than ever before. It is also easier to get caught than ever before. But there seems to be this kind of dynamic where people think it's okay to cheat, and in fact that it's worth doing. And I just, again, I come back to the marathon cheating. It horrifies me that this is happening on such a widespread scale.
Yeah, and I have the opportunity to speak to universities from time to time, and in talking to some of the professors, they'll express that what they've seen as the learning environment can often make a contribution to cheating. That can be the curriculum or the individual classes. So with certain curricula, students take required courses before they get to the courses that they care about. And to a certain extent, that's a recipe, if you have to take this course that you don't care about, for fostering maybe an extrinsic motivation, if you want to call it. I just need to get through this hoop to get to that stuff I want. And that can foster an environment where students are more likely to cheat. So some professors see it more in these required classes rather than when they get to their later years in the courses that they're going to use, in their chosen field after graduation. And there's also another factor in the classroom environment where we have these infrequent high stakes assessments. If you look at examples where the cheating happens, it's when students only maybe have two opportunities to show what they've learned, the classic midterm and the final, which has been around forever. And that intensifies the pressure on those two opportunities. You're not really letting them know whether they've learned the material, so they're more likely to cheat in those cases. If I only have 2 chances to do well, I'm more likely to cheat than if I had 10 chances. So some professors are being more thoughtful here, where they're giving the students multiple times to take an exam so they can get feedback and figure out what they need to work on, where it's not like half your grade is already down the tubes and I have to do anything, to get that grade in the final.
And there is something interesting about the way our kind of education system, but also other points in our lives where these one-shot chances, and if you fail to do it, there is no way of coming back from it, or at least it's very hard to come back from it, prompt that kind of behavior, because in effect, it's a one-off or opportunity, so you do everything you can. And I was reflecting on, what about other instances in life? And if you look at a driving test, the interesting thing about driving tests is you can fail. And for the record, listeners, I have failed on a number of occasions because I did a motorbike test and car test, and both took me a few times of doing it. But at least you can come back and do it again and find there's a bit of social embarrassment, but you get another crack at it. And so I think the more pressure people are put under examinations, and that maybe explains to teachers as well, because they're judged on the results that they can get. The more you do this one-off thing where it's one single moment in life where you have an opportunity, the more you're incentivizing people to react to the way the environment you've set up. You've set this test as a one-off hurdle. This is their Olympic final, if you like, or their Super Bowl or whatever, and you'll forever be judged by that thing. But even the Olympics and the Super Bowl, you get another crack at it, in a way that you don't in exams.
Yeah, I think more frequent assessments will start to see that, try, fail, get feedback on your learning. If you want people to remember things, they have to practice remembering them. So another reason more frequent assessment would be important is students would then have the opportunity to retrieve something from their memory multiple times, rather than I remember just cramming everything into my head for that midterm. And then you could ask me about it, 2 hours later, I don't remember anything. So it's just getting it in there, getting out and memorizing these formulas. And they get caught today trying to memorize these formulas. They write them down in a water bottle or a soda can or a ruler. Some of the professors today where I speak, where they've dealt with it, say, hey, you can have as many formulas as you want. I'm going to give you the test that requires maybe more critical thinking, a less cheatable situation, perhaps. So it's really incumbent on some of these professors too, who you can't use the same exam every year, that type of thing, to kind of change up how things are implemented. And it's also when students are confronted cheating, some of the professors have told me they view it as just like rolling through a stop sign, like the classic rationalization that I talk about in my talk. Oh, everybody does it. And whether they're a first generation college student or maybe academic integrity is just not something they've ever raised to view as important. The professors actually have to tell them, no, this is important, something to consider in your life. And you're not just rolling through a stop sign.
I guess, look, if you want to justify the behavior, and this is something we've absolutely talked about before, you'll find whatever rationale you want. And I think it's very easy to equate it to, minor things that kind of, but you could argue rolling a stop sign can be dangerous because you're not paying attention and you're just not complying with the spirit of the exercise. So even that example, you could say, actually isn't great either, because the purpose of stop is to get you to stop and look, not to slow down. Because if it wanted you to slow down, it would say slow down rather than stop. But I do think the contract of exams is, as you pointed out, if you don't change that, and you've seen a certain behavior pattern, or it's a classic behavioral science thing, right? Is you're not designing for the way people behave. You're designing for the way you would like people to behave. And we can all find examples of things where things are irritating because they're bureaucratic and tedious. And if the person who's spending it had to spend a moment of time doing the thing that they designed, they'd redesign it instantly. And I think exams is a good example of this, where we've paid attention over time to something. We've run a set of processes, and it's almost like this is what I had to do, so you'll also have to do it. And it hasn't moved with the times. And we've learned more about how people think. And I think there's something interesting generational as well, which is the retention of facts used to be important because you didn't have access to them all the time. Whereas you could argue now that Google permits anybody to know everything about anything. You don't need to retain information the same day that you would do historically. I remember, at school, I used to do the Order of the Kings of England. Now, not particularly useful information. It's good to know the history, but it doesn't help me in any way, shape, or form. And yet there were exams I went to where the way you passed the exam was being able to remember and it was even more crazy. Like Henry VIII had a number of wives, and you had to remember the order of the wives and what happened to them. And so you'd have silly little rhyming couplets that would help you remember the order. And I've still got them retained in my head now. And I sort of look at it and go, I understand the logic, right? Which is we want to make sure they've listened and paid attention. But does it really matter, what order they died in and what their specific names were in the scheme of things? Isn't it better to understand what was going on in society? And it's a very lazy test of information that's there. I can test this easily, so I'm going to test it. And you see this in companies as well, with mandatory training stuff where you'll get something like anti-money laundering in the case of banks. And then we better quiz you on this stuff, right? Because we need to make sure you've retained it. And the quiz they ask you, and I've seen a number of occasions, is questions like failure to comply with this will result in the following punishment. million fine, 5 years jail, 10 years jail, 15 years jail. And you sort of look at it and say, I understand what they're doing, right? They're saying, have you paid attention? But you don't want people answering that question, because I don't ever want anybody arguing the fact and going, hey, well, this one's only a 5-year sentence, whereas this is 15, so I'm going to go for that one, right? It's utterly absurd. You just need to know that you shouldn't do it. We shouldn't have to sort of help people understand the scale of the thing, because that's a matter for the judiciary if you've got yourself in that position. But that's how they test stuff. And I think the same mentality is there, which is sort of what is easy to test? How can we do it? How can we have a simple process? And we can kind of demonstrate that we've tested knowledge.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, I think testing critical thinking and understanding doesn't necessarily follow from being able to regurgitate.
Right. And here too, some of these service learning courses give out uncheatable assignments. So there's courses where students are engaged in solving more of an authentic problem outside the classroom and come back and write about it. That's an uncheatable exam. One other point I want to make here too is I often watch TED Talks for inspiration. And so in one of these deep dive into YouTube one night, I was watching a talk from Carol Dweck about research on mindset, which was really, really interesting. Yeah. She talks about not only students, it could be, people in the workforce either have a fixed or a growth mindset. For students, fixed mindset, all they say is, I can't write, I can't do math, I'm not good at this subject. I'm that way since birth. Whereas students with the growth mindset believe they can get better with hard work and effort. So the students with the fixed mindset who fail that midterm are much more likely to cheat on the final. Teachers, professors can try to instill a growth mindset in students, I suppose, saying learning is hard, but you're capable of getting better. But if you give feedback to the students that, hey, you're smart and talented, rather than saying you worked hard on this, so we get them, to talk to them more about learning, how they give the feedback, how I say to, even to my 10-year-old daughter, and then say, you're smart and talented, just say, hey, you worked hard on this. And how the class is structured to have less opportunities to cheat, so they aren't slammed to that first exam against going back to more frequent examinations where they can get that confidence even after initial setbacks. So changing that mindset, whether the classroom or the workforce, from fixed to growth. And
it's interesting when you do that, because there are some things that people are naturally talented at, and there are some things that people aren't. And we all have our own different balance of those things. And I think it's interesting that the way we assess people is on the output, which means that if you are particularly good at a certain subject, you can breeze through that thing because you get it. Languages would be a good example, right? Where maybe you've had a natural advantage that you've lived somewhere before, one of your parents or something, or you just have a gift for it and you pick it up quickly, as opposed to somebody that is less gifted or hasn't had that kind of head start. And yet the way these things are assessed is the same output either way. And so we're possibly measuring the wrong thing when it comes to incentivizing behaviors. And then the other bit that amused me, Noah, when you were talking, was a guy called Rory Sutherland. He's an advertiser, but he specializes in behavioral science and talks a lot about it. And he says, if you look at exams in schools, it's pretty useless because they ask you questions like, 2 buses moving at a constant speed in opposite directions, blah, blah, blah. And there's this kind of mathematical puzzle. And they're moving the key point. He just said, when does a bus ever move at constant speed? Right. It's an economically fabulous question. So from a sort of theoretical perspective, if you're measuring physics, right, or it makes a lot of sense. But you ask them these dumb questions that serve no purpose in reality, are utterly useless. When's the last time? And I look at some of the stuff I learned and you go, when am I ever going to use that? And the bit I love is you kind of know that when you're learning it, right? You sort of think this just doesn't, there is no part of my life where I recognize this is of any use whatsoever. And I think there's a lot of teaching that and then testing it that potentially doesn't help this either.
Great. Let's get into what we've been reading and watching over the past few weeks. So today I want to talk about Chernobyl, which is a 5-part miniseries on HBO. Fantastic story. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it yet, the show talks about the 1986 nuclear plant disaster, which occurred in the Ukraine. I guess it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, then of the Soviet Union, which came very close to being the worst accident in human history. So it tells the stories of the people who caused the disaster and the people who responded to it. It could have wiped out literally millions of people and rendered the whole place thousands of square miles uninhabitable for potentially centuries. In our interest today, Christian, it was 100% caused by human mistakes and incompetence.
I loved this TV show. It's one of the best things I have seen in a long time. So the other thing to note is that there is an amazing HBO podcast that accompanies the series. I was growing up when this thing happened, and I remember it was a big thing in news. Kids weren't allowed to play outside. So this was like real scary stuff at the height of the Cold War. And of course, this was one of the things that brought the Soviet Union down, was the scale of it. And so I've always been fascinated by this thing. I was so fascinated that a few years ago I went to Chernobyl to kind of experience this. And I've blogged about this on my website. So if people want to read this, we'll put a link in the show notes along with all the other things that we've referenced. But it's one of the most phenomenal sort of experiences because you've got danger everywhere, which is everything's radioactive, but you don't know that. There's no sign for you. And it's one of the scariest, most invigorating, possibly weirdest things I've ever done. And the TV show just brought that flooding back. And the human and raw emotion that they bring out in this piece and the frailties of human decision making are brilliantly rendered. So I love this show. I think I'm glad you've brought this up.
Yeah, there's so many directions we could go with behavioral science. I mean, right up front, I would say denialism in the interest of self-preservation is very present in the beginning, from the get-go. The plant officials refuse to acknowledge the extent of the damage after it occurs. There's a particularly crazy scene where I think it was the man in charge of the plant, the young guy who was put in there late, insists on accepting a radiation reading of something very small. I wrote it down. I think it was like 3.6 roentgens per hour because they called that the equivalent of a chest X-ray, but that's because that's as high as the dosimeter actually went. And it wasn't 3.6, it was actually 20,000 in some areas. So just thinking, oh my God, how did this happen? And the whole show, you feel like it's sort of like a horror show where you're not being chased by a monster, but you can't see the monster, right? You just know, you watch it and like, oh, don't open that door, don't go in there. What are you thinking? And talk about changing the story all the way back to the top to Gorbachev. You know, this guy calls this guy up the chain, this guy calls this guy. They slowly desensitize the information when he gets back all the way to the top, and just a great show about how humans can screw it all up.
There's that story of the recent incident that you and I were talking about before, where this isn't the last time this has happened.
Yeah, it was August 9th of this year, where there was a nuclear reactor went off in Russia, where I believe they were testing a missile that was powered by nuclear energy, and 2 people were killed, and it took the Soviet Union or Russia 2 days to disclose this information. So it's shocking to see that 33 years later, the Russian government still likes to keep secrets, or maybe not.
It's sort of built into the piece, which is, you know, if we can keep this quiet, then we'll get away with it. And of course, that didn't work in 1986. It was the Swedish government that detected things were going on, and then they asked questions, and actually even then it was denied, and it sort of took a little bit of time. But nowadays with satellite technology and with monitoring, and people are going to find out. And I'm struck with the parallels of the conversations we've had before about cheating. Right? Is you can try and hush this thing up, but at some point, someone somewhere is going to tell someone, this is something of this nature, people are going to find out.
Yeah, I think what we see from this is like a human being is probably most scared of being viewed as wrong. I mean, we can look around us, we can look in the mirror. You know, we keep pushing our own agenda, thinking it has to be true, but there's no way that's always going to be right. And so there's no shame. And I guess one of the takeaways, one of the lessons is there's no shame in admitting when you're wrong. And if you refuse to do that, it could be disastrous. I mean, how close it could have been to just wiping out so many people is amazing.
But I think there's something interesting in the political age, right, at the moment, where if you look at, we've got election going on in the UK at the moment, you know, you're building up for your next one in the US, and they're happening kind of everywhere, there is this strange thing about, even in Western democracies, where politicians don't want to admit they've screwed up.
Right.
Like there is something inherently wrong about making mistakes. In, you know, you're a loser in some people's terminology, or you're an idiot, or you couldn't even do X, Y, Z. And the prevalence of covering up, obfuscation, rewriting the narrative, but it all points to the same thing, right? Which is not wanting to talk about what's actually happened, not admitting the truth. And I think it's quite horrifying. And we laugh a little bit around the Soviets and their attempt to cover it up. And then this recent Russian incident. But actually, there's a load of stuff going on in countries where historically, I think you would have had people coming forward. And I find that there's a really interesting irony here in the age of transparency, where we've got more information, more visibility on things than we've ever had before. And yeah, there seems to be a greater attempt to mislead that goes to the highest thing. And that's why I think this TV show is so timely, because actually you can make it fun. You know, we're not living in a world where that's happening on most of our doorsteps. It does point to government conspiracies and cover-ups. And you don't have to look too far in the kind of Western world to see things that potentially, spiritually at least, might fit in that same misinformation, fake news categorization.
Certainly things will be coming back to future stories, I'm sure.
I've been reading this book called The Bank That Lived a Little, and it has a roller coaster on the front page. It's about Barclays, and having worked in the banking industry and regulated it, I'm fascinated by these tales of what was going on within the firms. And this is a sort of expose about how a relatively sort of traditional bank took itself off onto a big adventure. And that involved going into new territories, going into new businesses, having, pushing the envelope, if I was being generous to them. And of course, that caused them major amounts of problems. Now, they're by no stretch of the imagination the only firm. We saw Lehman Brothers as an example. We can all name firms that have collapsed. But this is a fascinating read because it really starts to, what this always comes down to is individuals. So the chapters, yes, you talk about historic events, but inevitably, when this guy's going through what's happened, it seems to be pretty well documented and researched. He's quoting kind of human decision-making and behavior and interaction. And I'm sure some of it is retrospectively constructed, but nonetheless, it's a sort of terrifying read. And I'm struck always as I read these things just by its human being screwing stuff up and the sort of the unwillingness to learn from past examples, the decision-making that's not always as clear and sensible and transparent as it could be. So it's one of many books of the thing, but it's really struck a chord with me as it's taking a firm all the way through its history right up until the present day.
It's on my list. And do you think, I remember from the crisis, Barclays didn't accept government funds as a bailout. They were very, very proud of that. But then later with LIBOR, they forced out Diamond. Do you think they went after them harder during LIBOR because they didn't accept, the government funds back in the day? Is there anything there?
There's a whole history of banks who talked about how well they'd survived the crisis because they were really smart. And so Deutsche Bank is a really good example of, full disclosure, former employer of mine who talked very much about how smart they had been. Now, not everybody in the firm had done this. And I don't want to malign every single person in that institution, but there were some senior people who made some very kind of, we're here because we get this stuff. And slowly what we've seen after the crisis is that, hey, guess what? They weren't quite as good at managing this. Some of the chickens are coming home to roost on that front. So I think there is something generic in the industry that sort of says, I want to have a clean narrative, right? I want to look like I'm on top of stuff. We're better than everybody else. And I think not taking government funding was a sort of key example because, government funding came with conditions. And so people didn't want, within the firms, didn't want to have their hands tied by taking government money. And government money, by the way, quite rightly came with conditions. And so they got other investments from the Middle East, for example. I think there certainly was anybody that wasn't taking government money was eyed very carefully. As we look at the behaviors of pieces, if you're somebody that looks like you're trying to get out of government scrutiny in a piece, I suspect you are probably viewed through a slightly different light. Yeah. Because there's no evidence, if you've got yourself in a position where you need funding, there is no evidence that you are better at managing this stuff or that you're going to act in a societally responsible way. And so I don't know whether I think if you asked anyone, they would absolutely outright deny the correlation between that and the fines. But I don't think it opens you up to sort of, regulators going soft on you if you have stepped away from the limelight and the transparency and the challenges that having government funding would bring.
Fascinating. It's on my list. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. Pleasure to be back with you again, Christian, and I look forward to returning in the future to talk about future topics.
And the same from me, Tom. Thanks, everybody, for listening. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, you can find it on Apple and Google Podcast or wherever you get yours. For more information on human risk and to read more about some of the subjects that we've covered in this episode, go to human-risk.com. And we'll see you very soon on another edition of the Human Risk Podcast.